Greetings and welcome to Informal Logic, Natural Language Argumentation. We're going to finish up this text from Douglas Walton, the eminent scholar in argumentation and informal logic. And I've adapted this from his book because, as some of these graduate level textbooks can be, it's not quite accessible to the typical audience of YouTube or for most people in general. Therefore, I kind of compiled this presentation, slideshow, so to speak. And as a special bonus, we get a little quiz at the end, a little fun quiz, so stick around. Let's get started. So, where we left off last time was on the ambiguity and vagueness. A term is said to be ambiguous if it has more than one meaning. For example, the term bank is ambiguous. It could mean savings bank in one context, but it could also mean riverbank in another context. And while we're waiting for that, let me double check that the chat's working here well and throw in see if the talking chat's working.
The crime says, hit the like.
Indeed, I think it's working there. Yes. Okay, let's proceed. So, a definition of an ambiguous terms. They're with multiple meanings. So we have a definition of vague terms with borderline cases too, and the need for precision relative to the context of the dialogue to gauge that vagueness or ambiguity, what degree, so that threshold. So examples of sentence ambiguity in newspaper headlines we'll go over, and the inherent vagueness in natural language. Example given here is rich or farmer. So here are some examples of ambiguity, and the English language is full of them. The man saw the duck with a telescope. Well, who has a telescope? The man or the duck? The man saw a duck with a telescope, or the man saw the duck because the man was using a telescope? I'm going to the bank. Are you going to the financial institution or a river bank? The chicken is ready to eat. Ready to be eaten, meaning you're going to have to feed it, or ready to be eaten, meaning you're going to eat it, or ready to eat, meaning it's ready to be fed. It's ready to eat. So is that chicken ready to eat, meaning you need to feed him, or ready to be eaten, meaning he's going to feed you? And we have all kinds of different ambiguities like that in the English language that can even be kind of humorous at times. Like the difference between roast beef and pea soup. Is that anybody could roast beef. All right, I digress. Let's continue. Here's part 2 with the consequences of the ambiguity and vagueness in the context. A pilot of a plane is taken off from Los Rodeos Airport in the Canary Islands. Radioed the message, "We are now at takeoff," to the tower. The pilot meant the message to say that the plane was now in the process of taking off, but the air controller took it to mean we are now at the takeoff point. So the pilot's really means to say we are now at takeoff, meaning he's in the process, but the air controller took it to mean that we're at the takeoff point, waiting to take off. The miscommunication led to the Tenerife airport disaster, the deadliest aviation accident in history. The context role in the there's the context role in disambiguating the terms. We had the serious consequence, loss of life and property. Problem of spurious precision in arguments, and the economic consequences of the vague term definitions. And I think this also, if I'm not mistaken, it had something to do with the translation, or English wasn't their primary language, something to that extent. But I digress there, I'm not even sure. Then there's the examples of ambiguity consequences. So we're going to go over the astronaut takes the blame for gas in the spacecraft, and the pilot's message that we are now at takeoff, and its tragic misinterpretation. Let's look at these in detail now that we have the outline of what we're looking at in the ambiguity and the vagueness. So in the headlines, we have the astronaut takes the blame for gas in a spacecraft. Apparently, there was a leak in a gas line somewhere in the spacecraft. When you first read the sentence, it seems to have another meaning, like could have several meanings. He passed gas in the spacecraft. Maybe he took a gas can like he's going to fill up his lawnmower in there. I don't know. And then, of course, what we just went over, the ambiguity in aviation communication, the tragic consequences of ambiguity. The pilot's message, we are now at takeoff. The pilot's meaning, we're in process of taking off. The controller's misinterpretation or interpretation is, we are at the takeoff point. The result was a collision with another aircraft, 583 lives lost. The pilot's meaning, in process of taking off. The controller's interpretation, at takeoff point. That's a tragic consequence of ambiguity. As they say, all rules in aviation are written in souls and blood. All right, let's see some of these loaded definitions, loaded terms, and question-begging language. So, an argument contains a loaded term, argumentatively loaded term, when a term in the argument is defined or used in such a way as to defeat or undermine the position of the participants in a dialogue to whom the argument is directed. So that's straight from the book. What he's getting at is the definition of loaded terms and how the loaded terms stack the arguments unfairly, because it's used in such a way to defeat or undermine the position. The distinction between loaded terms and question-begging language we'll be going over. The etymology of begging the question, the petitio principii, something like that. Petitio principii. Loaded definitions versus loaded terms. The question-begging language. So we'll go over this one first. Language that assumes the conclusion within the premise, creating a circular argument that doesn't provide independent support to the claim. The question-begging language with a circular argument. All right, just check and see if anyone is in the chat. If so, please hit the like and pipe up in there so I know this has got out. Maybe the notifications didn't go out. We could always restart if no one's here. It would be a shame to miss out on these parts here because we will be having a quiz at the end. But it seems like nobody's here.
Shadow Hippie 1776 says, hit the like button, people.
All right, so we do have someone here. Greetings to you, Shaggy Hippie.
Shadow Hippie 1776 says, it went out late.
Okay, then I guess we're low priority for the notifications. Nonetheless, we'll move on here, and anyone else can just rewind to catch up. We haven't gotten too far into it yet, but one thing we want to know is we have loaded terms here, and there's also loaded definitions. So let's start to look at the difference between loaded definitions versus loaded terms. How loaded terms stack arguments, okay, and the question-begging language. So the question-begging language is language that assumes the conclusion within a premise, creating a circular argument that doesn't provide independent support for the claim. So now we've listened to all that, let's start to get into part two here. But this is one of the examples. The doctrine is heresy. Therefore, this doctrine must be condemned. This is loaded terms combined with ad hominem attacks. It's a problem of one-sided argumentative definitions. So there you go. The scientific case studies of question-begging language will also be going over, including the psychological examples here, with a psychologist describing parents' behavior as gender prejudiced, and this is from like 1986. This is not the same. They had less genders back then. And this doctrine is heresy. Therefore, the doctrine must be condemned. Legal and scientific examples we'll go over is Black, that's Mr. Black, is defining murder as an unjustified killing. And the cladistics approach to animal classification. So we'll learn a little bit about these characters here. Let's start with a loaded term in psychology. So a psychologist commenting on the case of parents who encourage their little girl to play with dolls and their little boy to play with a model construction set describes the parents' behavior as gender prejudiced. He concludes that the parents should try harder to make their behavior gender neutral. The parents objected this term is applied to them because they say that they feel they are genuine and important differences between boys and girls. And according to their view, respecting these differences may be justifiable rather than prejudiced behavior. So the loaded term in psychology. Oh boy, that's used quite a bit. But do you see how we break this down here, right? According to their view, respecting these differences may be justifiable rather than prejudiced. In our view. Then we have heresy as a loaded term in the argument. This doctrine is heresy. Therefore, the doctrine must be condemned. The premise is labeling it as heresy. So the implicit assumption, heresy, equals wrong. So our conclusion, it must be condemned. So we see how they're trying to construct a valid argument, but it's a loaded term.
Strongnock says, I think I would have to tell the psychiatrist that he's actually crazy. Even as a child, boys and girls have different characteristics. Boys are absolutely stronger even from a very young age.
Indeed. Well, you can see here, though, the whole point of this is not to interject anything other than that your beliefs have a stronger justification rather than being prejudiced, as you just stated here, and as these parents stated the same. And yeah, I mean, what are they doing bringing their kid to this, or even talking to this quack in the first place? But that's a different question there. All right, let's proceed. So we're on to another example here, the loaded definition. Now we're going over loaded terms, saying that the doctrine is heresy. But here we have loaded definitions in a moral argument. Now we're going to Mr. Black and Mr. White. They're arguing about whether murder is always wrong. White concedes that murder is normally wrong, but argues that murder may not be wrong in exceptional cases. For example, if someone had murdered Hitler just before 1939, according to White, it would not have been a morally wrong act. Black argues that it can be established that murder is always morally wrong, based on a premise which he feels is reasonable. Then Black presents his argument. Murder is unjustified killing. Therefore, murder is always wrong. Interesting there. Do you see how the definition, murder is unjustified killing? And that means that killing Hitler isn't necessarily unjustified. So it wouldn't be considered murder. It would just be killing, I guess, according to Mr. Black's definition. So you can see, agreeing to the definitions first before the argument. All right, let's move along here. Come on. There we go. All right, now we're to the cladistics versus the evolution. Here's some question-begging language in biology. Now we're on some more of these scientific examples here. Fossils are just a bunch of bones at different time levels. Ancestry is something you fill in with your mind. So the cladistics believe that everything is classified based on shared traits today. They're agnostic about evolution, so it doesn't presume a common ancestry. They're classified the proportion of similarities. A traditional evolutionist considers evolutionary relationships in those classifications. It infers common ancestry from fossils. It may beg the question in classification. So you see the distinction here. And let's break this down a little bit further here. Thought we did. Okay. Nonetheless, what we have here is the fact that this is based on the similarities and a proportion of similarities, very logical and mathematical in the way you would classify by degrees. The traditional one uses inferring induction to figure out the relationships from a common ancestry. So it's inferring a lot and presuming a lot uh, to contrast with the cladistics, which classify based on proportions of similarities. All right, let's proceed. So we have equivocation and amphiboly. Let's start with the equivocation. The traditional fallacy of equivocation is said to occur in an argument when a word or phrase is used ambiguously and shifts into different meanings during the course of the argument. So it starts out at meaning A, but later in the argument it becomes meaning B. So you see here that the definition of equivocation as shifting meanings in arguments. It creates apparent validity without real validity because the contextual shift that enables the equivocation. Gradual equivocation in longer arguments gives more time to make that shift from one meaning to the next. Some classic examples. Well, this is a quick one. All stars are in orbit in outer space. Sarah Flamingo is a star. Therefore, Sarah Flamingo is in orbit in outer space. Here's another one. An elephant is an animal. A gray elephant is a gray animal. Therefore, a small elephant is a small animal. So you see how this equivocation falls apart in the logic. It doesn't apply as you go through the shifting meanings. Here's a paradoxical example. The more you study, the more you know. The more you know, the more you forget. The more you forget, the less you know. So why study? So you see here the paradox. There's a paradoxical example of equivocation or a shifting meaning. And this takes us to part 2, the amphiboly. Some sentences have more than one meaning because of the structural ambiguity of the sentence as a whole rather than because of the ambiguity of any single word or phrase in the sentence. So, this is the grammatical structure that creates the multiple interpretations of the amphiboly, not the equivocation, which is just that phrase. As you see here, it's a shift when a word or phrase is used ambiguously. The amphiboly is a structural ambiguity of the sentence as a whole. So, as a complete thought, the definition of grammatical ambiguity is the amphiboly. How amphiboly differs from a simple equivocation, we're going to get into the use of grammatical ambiguity in marketing. Bait and switch. You'll see this. And the legal disputes from grammatical ambiguity in contracts. So we'll have some media examples. A juvenile court to try shooting defendant. What does that mean? And 2 pizzas for 1 special price. And we have a legal example. The insurance policy interpretation dispute. Right, we're on to the grammatical ambiguity, the amphiboly, the ambiguous headline. Juvenile court to try shooting defendant. Well, we have 2 interpretations. One is the juvenile court will try a defendant who shot someone. So is the defendant a juvenile? Is just being tried by the juvenile court as a juvenile? Or was it a juvenile defendant who shot someone will be tried? So there's 2 interpretations because of the ambiguity of the headline. That's our media example. Now we're on to the ambiguous pizza example. The ambiguous pizza advertisement. Deceptive marketing language. The ad says, 2 pizzas for 1 special price. The customer interpretation, buy 1, get 1 free. Like we see down here, right? The seller's meaning, 2 pizzas at a special price. Outcome, higher price than expected. Customer's expectation was a regular price plus a free pizza. 50% off. But no, it's seller's defense. It's 2 pizzas for 1 great price. This is like you go to the diner, it says they're open 24 hours, and you show up and they're closed, and you say, but I thought you were open 24 hours. It says, yeah, but not in a row. All right, let's proceed. So we have another example here of the insurance policy ambiguity. So we're on to our little legal example here. The plaintiff's husband died as a result of a motor vehicle accident that occurred in Barbados. The bus in which the man died was transporting him, the plaintiff, and others from their hotel in Barbados to the airport at the end of their 14-day vacation. Let's see, the plaintiff's husband. Oh, okay, yeah, the plaintiff's husband died as a result. So the plaintiff and others from their hotel in Barbados to the airport at the end of their 14-day vacation. The couple had purchased a vacation package through an agent. As part of the package, they purchased accident insurance under a group policy. The policy provided $45,000 in coverage for death occurring in consequence of riding in, 1, any aircraft, or 2, any airport limousine or bus or surface vehicle sustained by the airline. The policy provided $15,000 in coverage for death arising out of the use of other public conveyances. The plaintiff argued that the words substituted by the airline in paragraph 2 above referred only to the words surface vehicle substituted by the airline. So they're saying that only surface vehicles substituted by the airline, not any. So okay, so it says it should be substituted by the airline first. So they say any airport, limousine, or bus, or a surface vehicle substituted by the airline. So there we go. The ambiguity in the insurance policy. Interesting. Let the jury decide. And we're moving on. I hope the notifications have been getting out. Make sure you all pay attention because there will be a short quiz at the end. Please hit the like so we get that notification out. So we have some arguments based on analogy. Arguments which press for consistency by means of a comparison between two cases alleged to be similar are arguments from analogy. So press for consistency by means of a comparison between two cases alleged to be similar. So we have case A, which is a known situation, and case B, which is a target situation. And we want to show that there's a consistency by means of comparison. So the definition of arguments from analogy. That's what that is. So how analogies press for consistency and shift burden of proof, we'll be looking at the principle of treating similar cases similarly, and the difference between analogies and logical consistency. We'll also look at using counter analogies to criticize arguments from analogy. We'll go over the legal examples here with a lawyer's argument about prisoners' voting rights and a comparison between prisoners and young people's voting rights. Key principle here is the arguments from analogy are plausible rather than inductive, relying on similarity between cases rather than statistical probability. So notice this here. They're based on analogy. They're based on plausibility, that possibility, right, rather than an inductive probability. So the plausibility rather than the probability based on inductive reasoning. So let's proceed. Some of these examples now, hopefully it'll make it clear. We have the prisoner voting rights. A lawyer for 3 prison inmates claimed that the law denying all sentenced prisoners the right to vote is irrational. The lawyer argued that the present law does not make sense because it excludes those who are in jail from voting, but allows those who are out on parole or awaiting sentence to vote. He also argued that the law makes no distinction between prisoners convicted for serious crimes and those imprisoned for minor infractions of the law. The lawyer argued that if lawmakers want to exclude prisoners from the democratic process, they must ensure that the reason is sufficiently important to override the constitutional right to vote. He concluded that the burden of proof must be on the state to show why prisoners should be denied this fundamental civil right. And we're on to the voting right comparison. In mock election held in high schools, teenagers have shown themselves politically aware and capable of expressing their views in a civilized fashion. On this evidence, it is reasonable to have more confidence in the ability to reason and sense of honesty and fair play of many 17-year-olds and less cause to be vigilant of their motives or integrity than you could say for many of those adults convicted of crimes. In our haste to create a fair and equitable society for all, does it really make sense to extend the right to vote to criminals and degenerates in our jail, but not to our young people? Why should anyone whose birthday falls on one day too late be any less entitled to vote than somebody else who has been found guilty of committing a crime and who has been exiled out of society behind bars? So you see an argument on both sides here. So there's our argumentative use of analogy. So argumentation scheme for each side can be represented as follows here. And again, this was the these are the what arguments on analogy are these. These are just basic. We're going over these different arguments based on analogy. So those are the voting right ones, and we're on to the alternative use of analogy or argumentative use of analogy. So the argumentation scheme for each side can be represented as follows, where S0 represents a situation of the Vietnam War, S1 represents a situation at the time of the American War of Independence, and S2 represents the situation in Nicaragua. So this is, again, the text was originally from around 1986, I believe. So that war in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas and the Contras and all that, that was a topic of the time. So they're using that example here just for some historical context. So with our example, we also have the Vietnam War as the reference case. And they're trying to relate that as analogy to American independence as a historical case. And then the Nicaraguan conflict there as the target case. So they're trying to use this argumentative use of analogy in a dispute, and how these analogies function in persuasion dialogue, and the distinction between the argumentative and non-argumentative use, which we'll be getting in closer, and why arguments from analogy are plausible rather than inductive. So here's our first one. We're looking at the Vietnam War as a reference case, American independence as a historical case, and Nicaragua as our target case. We're going to look at this political example, Reagan's comparison of Contras to American patriots, those Contra ponies. And then we're going to look at some practical examples about the inference about shoes wearing well, the car brakes analogy, and the description of baleen whales' hair-like fringe. And competing political analogies. Here we had Reagan versus Congress on Nicaragua aid. Reagan's position compares Contras to American patriots who fought in the War of Independence. As a positive analogy, the Contras equal freedom fighters. And the opposition compares the Nicaragua situation to Vietnam War. It was a negative analogy. The Contras equal the Vietnam quagmire, which was the pejorative at the time to attribute to the Vietnam War. So we use here now a shoe quality inference. Argument from analogy. I infer that a new pair of shoes will wear well on the grounds that I got good wear from other shoes previously purchased from the same store. Yet a past experience, previous shoes from the same store wore well. Your analogy is new shoes similar to previous ones. So the conclusion is that new shoes will also wear well. Now on to the car or brake maintenance analogy. Another argument from analogy. Bob has a certain type of car, and his brakes needed important repair work after he had driven it for 30,000 miles. We have just driven our new car of the same type for almost 30,000 miles. The next time we take it in for servicing, we should have the brakes checked. Past experience, same model car, needed a brake repair at 30,000. Analogy, our car is similar to Rob's, so that makes the analogy valid. And conclusion, check our brakes at the next service. Good use of the analogy. And now we're on to the example here of the non-argumentative analogy. The name of the baleen whale is derived from the long flexible plates which hang down from the roof of the whale's mouth, known as baleen or whalebone. The margin of each plate is frayed into a hair-like fringe, and the action of these fringed plates serves as a food strainer. So, we're making some non-argumentative analogies here. Baleen plates function as food strainer, hair-like fringe filters water. Not too many people are going to argue with that. All right, now we're on to criticizing arguments from analogy. I hope you all are still here because we're going to be getting to the quiz very soon. There are 3 basic critical questions for the argument from analogy. So here are questions. One criticism is to question whether the comparison between the two situations is plausible or right. So here's number 1. Is the comparison between the two situations plausible or right? Number 2. Are there relevant dissimilarities between the cases? So there's some relevant dissimilarities. And does the analogy support the conclusion? Analogies can be persuasive, yet potentially misleading. How relevant dissimilarities weaken analogical arguments. So you make analogies, but there's dissimilarities too. Once you throw those in, the analogies start to weaken. And with inductive reasoning, it's judged by strength and weakness. Role, a burden of proof in criticizing analogies, and the importance of context in evaluating analogical arguments. So we have a literary example here from Judge Kaczynski's novel and the Total Recall movie comparison. And we'll have a sports example. Not really, but it's a comparison between the Superdome and the Qualcomm Stadium. Sports. It's not really, but we'll see here. Persuasive power of analogy. So Judge Kaczynski, I'm not sure if he was a judge or that's just his name, but he wrote a science fiction novel about extracting a person's mind and implanting it into another person's head. When Total Recall came out in 1990, he found the similarities uncanny. The clincher was a scene where the villain kicks over a fish tank and the camera shows the fish squirming on the floor. An identical scene from his novel. He was initially convinced his novel had been pirated, but later he concluded it was just a coincidence because he recognized the persuasive illusion of striking similarity. This demonstrates how analogies can be seductive, yet misleading. But I would have to digress for a second here. Later concluded it was just a coincidence. That smells to me like an out-of-court settlement there. Nevertheless, the persuasive power of analogy was probably enough to at least get them there and not have to make a full payout. But I'm not sure about that. I'm only speculating. Digressed once again, but let's move back to our sports example here. This Superdome versus a Qualcomm comparison. Here's a stadium comparison analogy. The Superdome had death and mayhem. Qualcomm had Starbucks and free massages. So this was during the disaster in New Orleans from the hurricane Katrina. We had the Superdome. It had death and mayhem. It was flooded with no escape. There were 3 deaths. There was vandalism and drug abuse. And in the Qualcomm, this is in California, I think, the Starbucks there, and they had free massages. Sounds nice. And much better planning. And people could leave any time. It wasn't with no escape like the Superdome. And there was no fire danger. So the implicit conclusion was San Diego with the Qualcomm. White San Diego behaved better than black New Orleans is the implicit conclusion. The problem is the comparison ignores the critical contextual differences. Like, maybe they should have brought some Starbucks and free massages to the Superdome and allowed people to come and go. And nonetheless, you can see here where these slippery slope arguments now we get into. A slippery slope argument gets started when you are led to acknowledge that a difference between two things is not really significant. Once having acknowledged this first step, it may be difficult to deny that the same difference between the second thing and some other thing is likewise not really significant. So we have this chain of consequences, the definition of the slippery slope arguments. The chain argument form of slippery slope reasoning we see here goes from one to the next in the chain of argument. And how the slippery slope arguments exploit vagueness. We'll get into the Sorites argument as a type of slippery slope, and the domino effect argument as a counter tactic. So the domino effect argument as a counter tactic to the slippery slope. So we'll have a legal example with a speeding ticket argument, and the Sorites example with the argument about short men. Let's see how this works out. So the speeding ticket slippery slope. Slippery slope argument. 56 actual speed versus 55 speed limit. After all, it's really arbitrary that the agreed upon speed limit is 55 rather than 56, isn't it? It's just because 55 is a round number that is chosen as the limit. The argument here is the 1 mile per hour difference is insignificant, but the risk is that next speeder can claim the same exception, and the same for 2 miles and 3 miles and 4 miles over, right? So up to what? And what's the limit once you can get away with that? 20 miles, 40 miles over? So you can see how that slippery slope argument could be attacked here. But let's look at the Sorites argument with a slippery slope. Every man who is 4 feet in height is short. If you add 1/10 of an inch to a short man's height, he still remains short. Therefore, every man is short. So that there you see how this is a slippery slope. The chain of logical reasoning falls apart. Now we're on to subtle equivocations. Sometimes in a dispute about the meaning of a term in natural language, one side can be shown by appeal to linguistic evidence to have stronger claim. Appeal to linguistic evidence. So look at this. Longer arguments mask fallacies. And subtle equivocation is harder to detect. So equivocation is harder to detect in longer arguments. The role of context in identifying subtle equivocations we'll get into, and disputes about term meanings becoming verbal disputes. The relationship between the equivocation and question-begging language, and the importance of a global perspective in detecting equivocation. Here's some example of subtle equivocation. Following the law is obligatory. Failing to do something obligatory is morally wrong. Therefore, failing to follow the law is morally wrong. So the subtle equivocation is harder to detect, and it's a longer argument, masking the fallacies. Now we have the variability of strictness of standards. Start with the problem. If vague terms are used in a consistent manner throughout an argument, there may be no logical difficulties or fallacies in the use of these vague terms in the argument. A problem can arise, however, where a vague term occurs more than once in different propositions in an argument, and differing standards of precision are required at each occurrence to make the propositions plausible. So, keeping at the same level of precision, standard of precision, for a degree of abstractness, things like that. So you want to be at the same standard of precision. So a vague term and consistent use can also lead to a vague term with shifting standards. So varying standards of precision are what create the equivocation. standards of precision. So the vague term can be okay and no logical difficulties, but it's where it's used more than once in different propositions and differing standards of precision. So the problem of vague terms requiring different standards and different premises we'll go over, and the subtle nature of equivocation through shifting standards. And our examples here will be Larry's argument about marriage. So, of course, we're going to make sure we get into this one here. First, we're going to kind of look at the structure here, the variability of strictness of standards, the argument analyzed. He says here, getting married involves promising to live with a person for the rest of your life. But nobody can safely predict compatibility with another person for life. So let's break this down. Number one, getting married involves promising to live with a person for the rest of your life. Number two, if you promise to live with someone for the rest of your life, you must be compatible with them for life. Proposition 3, nobody can safely predict compatibility with another person for life. So this is our breakdown of Larry's arguments into his premises. Identifying the vague terms, compatible, safely predict. So these are the vague terms. Note these. Each premise seems plausible on its own. The argument's validity depends on shifting standards for these terms. So let's break this further. Number 4, therefore, nobody should get married. 5, if nobody should get married, the marriage is irrational. 6, therefore, marriage is irrational. So Larry's got some very long argument here. Let's break this down further. So if we look at these figures here, we'll see the diagrams of his standards. So first he's saying compatibility and the standards, the shifting standards here, right? The strictness of the standards. With compatibility, it's a high standard, really getting along smoothly, versus a low standard, functioning as a coexisting with tolerable friction. So these are the two standards, a high standard, really getting along, and a low standard. We look at from the context of safely predicting, though, the high standard, predict without chance of error, versus a low standard, be reasonably assured, but expectations could arise, or exceptions could arise. So we see here the difference in the standards, that the low standard of compatibility for when you're looking at to safely predict, but the compatibility in general as a high standard, getting along really smoothly. But to safely predict compatibility without chance of error at a high standard is not necessarily the same compatibility here as attainability. So let's continue here. We also have, as we see here, now getting back to those propositions 2, 4, 3, and 2. So the compatible, high standard and low standard, 2 and 4. Let's jump back to that slide. So 2 is if you promise to live with someone for life, you must be compatible. And 4 is therefore nobody should get married. So what he's looking at here on this slide here, we see get back there. All right. Yep, 35 had the numbers. There we go. Okay, so for the high standard is that someone you're going to live with the rest of your life. It's a very high standard. And the low standard here for compatibility number 4, therefore, nobody should get married. A very low standard on compatibility because of assuming that this is where it's going to fall. And then we go look at this here on safely predict. When we're looking at from this. So the shifting terms or shifting standards, we have a low standard number 3 and a high standard of number 2. So if we look here for number 3, nobody can safely predict compatibility with another person for life. So if no one safely can predict, that's a low standard. Then for the high standard, Number 2, if you promise to live with someone for life, you must be compatible with them for life. So we're using the same proposition here. And you see how the shifting standard happens. So number 2 is here as opposed to this low standard. So this diagram summarizes how the argument requires a high standard for compatibility in one premise, but a low standard in another, revealing the equivocation. Pretty complex, nonetheless. You can see how that works there. Now, the variability of strictness of standards. Let's look at this analysis here of the equivocation. With respect to the two vague terms, compatible and safely predict, in the argument of example we just saw there, what is the most plausible interpretation of the standard of precision appealed to in one's premise is the least plausible interpretation in another premise. The most plausible interpretation of each term at the occurrence is summarized in figure 9.3, which we looked at there. What has gone wrong with the argument of example 9.2.5 is that the vague terms appeal to different standards of precision in different premises during the course of the extended argument. The result is a kind of ambiguity imposed on the person to whom the argument is directed when he tries to interpret each individual premise as a plausible proposition. So it is a classical case of equivocation, yet one that occurs in a subtle, pragmatic context of shifting standards over the course of an argument as it develops in dialogue. So we had the shifting standards. The terms require different standards in different premises. Cognitive burden, ambiguity imposed on the argument's recipient. As you see, it takes a lot of thinking to really dissect where it gets disjointed. And the dialogue context. Equivocation occurs in pragmatic context of shifting standards. It's slick. All right. That brings us to our conclusions here. In any analysis of an argument, therefore, an important step prior to criticizing the argument is to reconstruct the context of the dialogue in order to see what its purpose can reasonably be presumed to be. So charity for the one making the argument to try to construe it in best faith to its most feasible intent. Context is essential for identifying and evaluating fallacies in natural language arguments. So longer arguments can mask fallacies. Look out for that prolix. Remember, the surplusage in prolix. It's not approved in pleadings nor in arguments because it masks fallacies. The principle of charity, there it is, the principle of charity, in interpreting vague or ambiguous terms. So, the relationship between loaded definitions and loaded questions, as we saw there, and the distinction between loaded definitions and question-begging epithets, and the role of plausible reasoning in natural language argumentation. So we have Whatley's observation is, long discussions are often but veils of fallacy. And Mackey's approach, focus on discovering exactly what an argument is before evaluating it. So instead of arguing over premises and propositions, get the definitions and the precision and the standards clear and correct first before evaluating the argument as a whole. All right, how many people are still here? It takes us now to the best part of the presentation where we get to test your knowledge with a fun quiz here. So you guys got to pipe up in the chat. You can just put the number of the question in the letter, or if you're fast, just hit the letter for the question as I read it out. So we have a headline in the newspaper. It says, Juvenile Court to Try Shooting Defendant. What makes this headline ambiguous? Is it the defendant's age? The court's location? Who is doing the shooting? Or the type of court? Any takers on that one? Please pipe up in the chat. All right. They just hit the number 1 and then the letter of your choice. And I'm going to move on to question 2. One group calls them freedom fighters. Another calls them terrorists. What is this an example of? Is it a simple disagreement? Is it the use of loaded terms? Is it an argument from analogy? Or is it a slippery slope? Come on, someone's going to pipe up in there. Let's continue. A politician argues, managing the national budget is like managing
Hippie 1776 says B.
B is for which number are you choosing B for? Is that for number 2? We'll take B for number 2. All right. So we got B noted for number 2. Number 3, the politician argues managing the national budget is like managing.
Hippie 1776 says 2.
Yes. So for number 1, anyone take a guess at number 1, the juvenile court to try shooting defendant. What makes it ambiguous? The defendant's age, the court's location, who is doing the shooting, the type of court. So let's move along here. Number 3 is we're looking to see the managing the budget is like managing a household budget. The national budget is like managing a household budget. We must stop spending more than we earn. What is the goal of this analogy? For number 3, is it to simplify a complex issue? Is it to win an argument by comparison? Or is it to use a metaphor? Or is it to confuse the audience? So number 3, it's either to simplify a complex issue. When you say managing the national budget is like managing a household budget, we must stop spending more than we earn. The goal of that analogy. Hang on a second, I gotta clear the chat here. To win the argument by comparison, to use a metaphor, or to confuse the audience. And we're on to number 4.
Hippie 1776 says 3A.
3A, you sure? Remember, it's the goal of the analogy we're asking. What is the goal of using the analogy? So he's arguing, and we must stop spending more than we earn. He's trying to do what? What's his intention here? What's the goal of using an analogy? So I'll give you a second chance on that before we do the final answer. And then we'll move on to number 4. And if we allow the city to build one new park, soon they'll be tearing down all our homes for green space.
1776 says B.
All right, we'll take that as your final answer. And then we're on to number 4. If we allow the city to build one new park, soon they will be tearing down all our homes for green space. What fallacy is this? Is that the equivocation, the ad hominem, the slippery slope, or the begging the question? So the equivocation is using the vagueness there, the ad hominem's attacking the person. The slippery slope is the chain of argumentation that falls apart, and begging the question with a circular argumentation. So which is if we allow the city to build one new park, soon
Hippie 1776 says C.
C. Okay, good one there. And no one wanted to take, we took a guess at A here, huh? 3 for A. I'm sorry, C for A. 3 for number 1, we didn't get A1, but I'll go ahead and I'll pick C for us. All right, let's move on and see how we did. So answer number 1, C. It was about who is doing the shooting. This is an amphiboly. Sentence structure is ambiguous. Make it unclear if the defendant or the court is doing the shooting. Well, that's another way to look at it too. Juvenile court to try shooting. Oh, I see. Instead of being tried. Oh, I see this info. Well, I didn't even think of it that way. But yes, the juvenile court's going to try to shoot the defendant. Then again, I've never seen a court operate a gun, but that's neither here nor there. Nevertheless, it's an amphiboly. Another thing is like there's a lot of amphibies which are kind of, I guess, it get to be humorous. What's green and furry, has four legs? If it fell out of a tree, it would kill you. Anyone want to pop up in the chat what that is? And the answer would be a pool table. All right, so let's continue. Number 2, the answer was B, the use of loaded terms. The freedom fighters and the terrorists are emotionally charged terms used to frame the same event in a way that supports one side's argument. So again, freedom fighters and terrorists, very loaded terms. Now we're on to number 3. The answer correct again, B, to win an argument by comparison. This is an argument from analogy. It compares a complex issue, the national budget, to a simple one, household budget, to persuade the audience. Is to win the argument by comparison. That's the argument from analogy. And finally, we had answers for number 4 was C, the slippery slope. This fallacy argues that a small first step will inevitably lead to a chain of related negative events without sufficient evidence. All right, and that takes us to the end of the presentation here of informal logic and natural language argumentation. And I guess if there's any, I appreciate you all being here for the end, especially Shaggy Hippie there, to throw in some answers here for the test to make it a little bit more fun for everyone. And I understand that the notifications did go out late, but please hit the like for those of you that are here. So maybe someone else have some fun. This does.
Shaggy Hippie 1776 has donated $5 and says, "God bless, brother, for the questions."
Wow, thank you very much. And I'm sure, again, other people may very well find this informative and educational to them and learn a few tidbits along the way for getting along more civilly within different types of dialogues and other instances where the natural language and the ambiguities and the other inconsistencies and imprecisions that come along with it allow us to stray along from the logic and the reason that we may have intended originally to use. But then the value of the persuasion and the rhetoric really is something that can dissuade some from staying on the road of rational, reasonable logic. I think understanding this in the bigger context is the road to a wisdom and a clear understanding of truth. So that being said, I'd like to salute and thank you all for being here. Shaggy Hippie, thank you for the extra tip bonus there, and that's always appreciated. We got these tests here just to make sure everyone's paying attention. I guess as long as someone is and we score that well on it, then it's worth the while. Again, this takes us to the end of our presentation entirely of this whole series on informal logic. We've actually made it through the entire book from Douglas Walton, excellent author. Book is written again for a graduate study. It's a little bit hard to digest here, so I have been able to put it together through the chapters into these presentations for us to digest and have a little bit of fun with here on the YouTube channel. So once again, I thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you all on the next one. Peace out.